live television took a sharp turn when a simple question sparked an on-air clash. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not through shouting or spectacle, but through a quiet shift in tone that everyone in the room can feel? That's what unfolded during this daytime talk show segment, when Brad Pitt appeared on a panel-style program similar to The View and found himself in a tense, unscripted disagreement with Whoopi Goldberg. Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. Brad Pitt's appearance was promoted as a standard daytime interview, the kind audiences are used to seeing when a major actor is making the rounds. He was there to discuss recent work, charitable efforts, and what had been a busy stretch in his career. The atmosphere at the start of the segment was relaxed. The hosts welcomed him warmly, the audience applauded enthusiastically, and the early moments followed a familiar rhythm. Light conversation, shared laughs, and brief reflections on his career set an easy pace. Brad Pitt appeared calm and engaged, leaning slightly forward in his chair, making eye contact with each host as they spoke, and responding in a measured, thoughtful way. As the discussion moved along, the panel shifted toward broader topics, which is typical for shows of this format. The hosts began talking about public responsibility, celebrity influence, and how well-known figures navigate speaking out on social and cultural issues. At first, the exchange remained polite and conversational. Brad Pitt spoke about choosing projects carefully and being mindful of the messages that accompany fame. Whoopi Goldberg listened closely, nodding at points, occasionally interjecting to clarify or steer the conversation. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came gradually, through a question that was framed casually but carried weight. One of the hosts asked Brad Pitt about the expectation that actors should use their platforms to comment on current issues. He answered carefully, saying he believed in supporting causes, but also felt that sometimes listening mattered more than speaking. His tone remained calm, and there was no visible tension at that moment. Whoopi responded by acknowledging his point, but adding that silence from influential figures can also send a message, whether intended or not. Her delivery was firm but controlled, the way longtime talk show hosts often speak when they're making a serious point without trying to escalate things. Brad Pitt shifted slightly in his seat, pausing before responding. That pause was noticeable, not uncomfortable, but it marked a change in pacing that viewers could feel. He replied by saying that public conversations are complicated and that he didn't believe there was a single correct way for celebrities to engage. He emphasized personal responsibility and cautioned against turning every issue into a public performance. The studio audience remained quiet, listening closely, and the other hosts looked between the two, aware that the conversation was becoming more pointed. Whoopi leaned in slightly, her expression focused. She said that while she understood his perspective, she disagreed with the idea that speaking out automatically turns into performance. She shared her experience of being on television daily and feeling a responsibility to address issues that affect people watching at home. Her voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable firmness to it. At this point, the energy in the room had changed. The polite back and forth gave way to something more direct. Brad Pitt responded by clarifying that he wasn't criticizing those who speak out, but rather expressing concern about oversimplifying complex issues. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, but his body language showed a bit more tension, his hands clasped together as he explained himself. The hosts attempted to keep the conversation flowing, with one briefly jumping in to summarize both perspectives and move the discussion forward. However, Whoopi wasn't quite finished. She acknowledged his clarification but reiterated that from her viewpoint, the audience expects honesty and leadership from people with large platforms. She stressed that daytime television is about conversation, even when it's uncomfortable. Brad Pitt nodded, but he also pushed back gently, saying that discomfort can be productive, but only if it leaves room for nuance. His tone remained respectful, but the disagreement was now clearly defined. The audience reacted with scattered applause, signaling engagement rather than taking sides. As the segment continued, the pacing slowed. The hosts allowed longer responses, fewer interruptions, and the conversation took on a more serious tone than originally planned. Whoopi shared a brief anecdote about moments on the show when difficult conversations led to viewer feedback, both positive and negative. Brad Pitt listened attentively, occasionally nodding, but when he responded, he emphasized personal growth and learning rather than public debate. The exchange didn't involve raised voices or dramatic gestures. Instead, it was the kind of tension that comes from two people standing firmly in their perspectives. Whoopi's posture remained upright and confident, while Brad Pitt leaned back slightly, signaling reflection rather than retreat. The studio audience stayed mostly silent, reacting only with light applause at key moments. As the conversation reached its peak, one of the co-hosts attempted to bring things back to common ground, noting that both perspectives came from a place of responsibility. Whoopi agreed, but added that disagreement is part of meaningful dialogue. Brad Pitt echoed that sentiment, saying he appreciated the chance to talk it through, even if they didn't fully agree. When the segment wrapped, the tone softened. Whoopi thanked Brad Pitt for engaging honestly, and he returned the thanks, acknowledging the value of the discussion. The audience applauded warmly, and the show transitioned to the next segment without lingering on the disagreement. After the episode aired, viewers reacted quickly. Social media discussions focused less on conflict and more on the substance of the exchange. Some praised Whoopi for pressing the issue, while others appreciated Brad Pitt's thoughtful approach. Clips circulated online, with viewers commenting on how rare it is to see a calm but genuine disagreement on daytime television. In the days following the show, the hosts briefly referenced the segment, noting the volume of viewer feedback it generated. They clarified that the conversation reflected differing viewpoints, not personal animosity. Brad Pitt's representatives also emphasized that he valued the opportunity to engage in open discussion. As a piece of daytime television, the moment stood out not because of spectacle, but because it showed how live conversations can shift unexpectedly. It reminded viewers that even familiar formats can produce moments of real tension and thoughtful exchange. If you watch the segment, or if you have thoughts on how the conversation unfolded, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories. As the show moved forward after that initial exchange, the atmosphere didn't snap back to light or casual right away. Instead, there was a noticeable effort from everyone at the table to stay measured and thoughtful, as if the panel understood they had entered a more serious space and needed to handle it carefully. The conversation resumed with one of the co-hosts reframing the topic slightly, asking about how public conversations evolve once they leave the studio and move into online spaces. Brad Pitt responded first, explaining that what happens after a show airs often feels out of an individual's control. He talked about how a single sentence can be clipped, shared, and interpreted in ways that don't reflect the full conversation. His tone was even, but there was a sense that he was speaking from experience. He kept his gaze mostly toward the host who asked the question, occasionally glancing toward Whoopi as he spoke, signaling that he was still engaging directly with her perspective. Whoopi listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but attentive. When it was her turn to respond, she acknowledged his point about social media amplification and agreed that context is often lost. However, she added that the solution isn't to pull back from conversations, but to be clearer and more direct when speaking publicly. She explained that viewers at home often rely on these shows to hear discussions that feel accessible and honest, not carefully filtered. The exchange remained calm, but the underlying disagreement continued to shape the discussion. Brad Pitt nodded as she spoke, then replied that clarity is important, but so is humility. He said that sometimes it's better to admit uncertainty than to offer definitive opinions on complex topics. His posture remained composed, shoulders relaxed, but his hands moved slightly as he emphasized certain points, showing a bit more engagement than earlier. One of the other hosts stepped in to keep the conversation balanced, pointing out that daytime talk shows thrive on multiple viewpoints and that disagreements, when respectful, can be valuable for audiences. This comment seemed to ease the room slightly. The studio audience responded with a small round of applause, acknowledging the sentiment rather than siding with anyone in particular. Whoopi followed up by saying that disagreement isn't the issue, avoidance is. She clarified that her concern wasn't about Brad Pitt specifically, but about a broader trend she sees among public figures who choose silence out of fear of backlash. Her voice remained steady, but her words carried weight. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table, a posture viewers recognize as her signaling seriousness. Brad Pitt took a moment before answering. The pause was brief but noticeable, the kind that happens when someone is choosing their words carefully on live television. He then said that fear can play a role, but so can a desire to avoid oversimplification. He stressed that he believes conversations should create understanding, not just reactions. At this point, the hosts allowed the exchange to continue without interruption, trusting both speakers to keep it respectful. The pacing slowed further, with longer responses and fewer quick interjections. The audience remained quiet, listening closely, occasionally reacting with soft murmurs or light applause. Whoopi responded by sharing that, from her experience, audiences often appreciate honesty even when it's imperfect. She said that daytime television isn't about having all the answers, but about starting conversations that people can carry into their own lives. Her tone softened slightly here, shifting from challenge to explanation. Brad Pitt acknowledged that point and said he appreciated hearing her perspective. He added that his own approach comes from trying to balance personal values with public expectations. There was no defensiveness in his voice, but there was a clear effort to explain himself fully. Another host tried to bring in a lighter element, joking briefly about how serious talk can sneak up on guests who come in expecting a promotional interview. The comment drew a small laugh from the audience and a smile from Brad Pitt, easing the tension just a bit. Whoopi smiled as well, though she quickly returned to the discussion, emphasizing that these moments are part of what makes live television meaningful. As the segment progressed, the disagreement became less about opposing views and more about contrasting philosophies. Brad Pitt framed his thoughts around restraint and reflection, while Whoopi emphasized engagement and responsibility. Neither raised their voice, and neither appeared angry, but the difference in outlook was clear and sustained. The hosts occasionally summarized points to ensure clarity for viewers, a common technique in daytime talk shows when conversations become layered. These summaries helped keep the discussion accessible and prevented it from feeling like a debate that only insiders could follow. Brad Pitt mentioned that he often prefers to support causes privately, through funding or behind-the-scenes work, rather than public statements. Whoopi responded by saying that private support is important, but public acknowledgement can inspire others to act. Her response wasn't accusatory, it was framed as a belief shaped by years of audience interaction. The studio audience reacted to this exchange with a mix of nods and applause, suggesting that viewers were connecting with both sides. The camera occasionally cut to audience members listening intently, reinforcing the sense that this was a shared moment rather than a confrontation. As the conversation began to wind down, one of the co-hosts thanked both Brad Pitt and Whoopi for keeping the discussion respectful and open. This acknowledgement seemed intentional, a way to reassure viewers that disagreement doesn't have to mean conflict. Brad Pitt smiled and said he appreciated the chance to talk honestly. Whoopi responded in kind, saying that these conversations are why she values live television. The tone at the table had softened, even though the core disagreement hadn't been fully resolved. The segment ended not with a clear conclusion, but with mutual respect. The audience applauded, not loudly, but steadily, as the show transitioned to a commercial break. For viewers watching at home, it felt like witnessing a genuine exchange rather than a manufactured moment. In the minutes after the show returned, the hosts briefly referenced the conversation, framing it as an example of thoughtful disagreement. There was no attempt to sensationalize it, just an acknowledgement that meaningful conversations can sometimes feel uncomfortable. As clips of the segment began circulating online later that day, viewers commented on how rare it is to see a calm, sustained disagreement on daytime television. Some praised Whoopi for pressing her point, while others appreciated Brad Pitt's measured responses. The discussion continued beyond the studio, exactly as both had described during the show. And as the episode became part of the day's television conversation, it served as a reminder that live talk shows still have the power to surprise, not through spectacle, but through honest, unscripted dialogue. As the show returned from the commercial break, there was a subtle but noticeable reset in energy. The host smiled, the lighting and music signaled a continuation rather than a pivot, and Brad Pitt was still seated at the table, suggesting that the conversation hadn't been cut short or redirected behind the scenes. For viewers at home, this was an indication that whatever tension had surfaced earlier was considered appropriate and manageable within the format of the show. One of the co-hosts gently reintroduced the topic by referencing how often conversations like these resonate differently depending on who's watching. She mentioned that daytime audiences include people from a wide range of backgrounds, many of whom tune in daily and form a sense of connection with the panel. This framing shifted the focus slightly away from Brad Pitt and Whoopi as individuals and toward the broader impact of public dialogue. Brad Pitt responded by agreeing that audiences bring their own experiences into these conversations. He said that he's learned over time that no matter how carefully something is phrased, people will hear it through their own lens. His voice remained calm, and his delivery was steady, almost reflective. He wasn't trying to persuade at this point as much as explain how he navigates being interpreted by millions of viewers. Whoopi nodded as he spoke, signaling that she understood that reality. When she responded, she emphasized that the very reason people project their own experiences onto these conversations is why she believes they matter so much. She said that daytime television reaches people in their living rooms, kitchens, and workplaces, often during ordinary moments of their day, and that gives these discussions a particular weight. The disagreement resurfaced, not as a clash, but as a difference in emphasis. Brad Pitt talked about personal responsibility and internal reflection, while Whoopi talked about communal responsibility and shared dialogue. The way they spoke to each other remained respectful, but there was a noticeable firmness in both of their tones, suggesting neither was willing to fully concede their point. At one moment, Brad Pitt mentioned that he sometimes worries about conversations becoming more about reaction than understanding. He explained that when discussions turn into sound bites, they can lose their ability to create real change. As he spoke, he gestured lightly with his hands, palms open, a body language cue that suggested openness rather than defensiveness. Whoopi responded by saying that reaction isn't always negative. She pointed out that emotional responses can be the starting point for deeper thinking and action. Her voice was steady, but there was a slight increase in intensity, not in volume, but in emphasis. She leaned forward again, a posture viewers associate with her making a deliberate point. The audience remained engaged, reacting quietly. There were a few nods visible, a few murmurs of agreement, but no loud applause or interruptions. It felt like the kind of attentive silence that happens when viewers are genuinely listening rather than waiting for a punchline. One of the co-hosts interjected briefly to say that the show often hears from viewers who appreciate seeing hosts and guests disagree respectfully. This comment seemed aimed at contextualizing the exchange for those watching at home, reassuring them that what they were seeing was intentional and valued. Brad Pitt smiled slightly at that and said that he appreciated being in a space where disagreement doesn't automatically mean conflict. He acknowledged that not all platforms allow for nuance and said that he values conversations where people can explain themselves fully. His tone here was warmer, and the tension seemed to ease just a bit. Whoopi responded by agreeing that nuance is important, but she added that clarity is equally important. She said that viewers often want to know where someone stands, even if that stance evolves over time. Her point wasn't framed as a challenge, but as an observation drawn from years of audience feedback. As the discussion continued, the pacing became more fluid. The back and forth felt less like a debate and more like a shared exploration of ideas. Brad Pitt talked about how his views have changed over the years and how he's become more comfortable acknowledging uncertainty. Whoopi talked about how her own perspective has been shaped by listening to viewers and co-hosts with different life experiences. The hosts occasionally nodded, smiled, or added brief comments to keep the conversation inclusive. No one tried to dominate the exchange, and there was a clear effort to maintain balance. The camera shots alternated between close-ups and wider angles, showing the full table and the audience, reinforcing the sense that this was a collective moment. At one point, Brad Pitt mentioned that he believes listening is often undervalued in public discourse. He said that sometimes stepping back and absorbing different viewpoints can be more productive than immediately responding. His tone was thoughtful, and his delivery was unhurried. Whoopi responded by saying that listening and speaking aren't opposites, but parts of the same process. She explained that speaking out can invite others to share their experiences, creating a cycle of exchange rather than a one-way statement. Her voice softened slightly here, signaling a shift from disagreement to synthesis. The audience reacted with light applause, the kind that acknowledges a point without turning it into a moment of victory. The tension that had defined earlier parts of the segment seemed to settle into a more reflective mood. As the conversation approached its final minutes, one of the co-hosts summarized what had been discussed, noting that the exchange highlighted different ways people approach public responsibility. This summary helped ground the discussion and prepare viewers for the transition to the next topic. Brad Pitt nodded in agreement with the summary and thanked the panel for allowing space for the conversation. He said that he values these kinds of discussions because they challenge him to think more deeply about his own choices. Whoopi responded by saying that she appreciated his willingness to engage rather than deflect. She emphasized that live television works best when people are honest, even when that honesty leads to disagreement. The segment didn't end with a definitive conclusion, but with a sense of mutual respect. The audience applauded as the hosts thanked Brad Pitt again, and the show moved forward. For viewers watching live, it felt like witnessing a genuine exchange unfold in real time, without being rushed or smoothed over. As the episode continued, the earlier tension lingered just enough to give the show a sense of authenticity. It wasn't a moment designed to go viral, but it was one that stuck with viewers because it reflected how real conversations often unfold, thoughtfully, imperfectly, and in public. As the episode moved deeper into its second half, the earlier exchange continued to shape the tone of the table, even as the conversation shifted to adjacent topics. There was no abrupt change, no clear signal that the discussion had ended, but rather a gradual widening of the lens. One of the co-hosts brought up how audiences often expect celebrities to be consistent in their messaging, even as their views evolve over time. It was a natural extension of what had already been said, and it kept Brad Pitt and Whoopi engaged without reopening the disagreement in a sharp way. Brad Pitt responded by acknowledging that consistency can be difficult, especially when personal understanding grows or changes. He explained that people often expect public figures to speak with certainty, even when the reality is more complicated. His tone remained thoughtful, and his posture stayed relaxed, suggesting he was comfortable continuing the conversation rather than eager to move away from it. Whoopi listened closely, and then added that audiences are often more forgiving than people assume. She said viewers understand growth, but they also want transparency. Her point wasn't framed as criticism, but as insight drawn from decades of interacting with audiences on live television. She spoke evenly, with a calm authority that reflected her experience. The hosts allowed the exchange to unfold without interruption, trusting the rhythm that had developed. The audience remained attentive, reacting occasionally with nods or soft applause when a point resonated. There was a sense that everyone in the room understood this was a moment of genuine dialogue, not something to rush through. Brad Pitt mentioned that he sometimes worries about being misunderstood when he speaks publicly, especially when conversations are condensed into short clips. He said that nuance often gets lost once a segment leaves the studio and enters the broader media ecosystem. His hands rested on the table as he spoke, his gestures minimal, reinforcing the seriousness of his point. Whoopi responded by saying that misunderstanding is part of public conversation, but that avoiding conversation altogether doesn't solve that problem. She emphasized that even imperfect discussions can open doors for learning and empathy. Her voice remained steady, and her expression was thoughtful rather than confrontational. One of the co-hosts chimed in briefly to note that the show often hears from viewers who appreciate seeing these kinds of exchanges precisely because they reflect real life. She said that not every conversation has to end in agreement to be valuable. This comment seemed to resonate with both Brad Pitt and Whoopi, who nodded in acknowledgement. As the discussion continued, the tension that had once felt sharp now felt more subdued, replaced by a sense of mutual consideration. Brad Pitt spoke about the importance of choosing when and how to engage, explaining that he believes timing and context matter just as much as content. He said that sometimes waiting allows for more informed and thoughtful participation. Whoopi responded by agreeing that timing matters, but she reiterated that visibility also matters. She explained that when people see familiar faces addressing difficult topics, it can make those topics feel less distant or abstract. Her tone was explanatory, not insistent, and it reflected a desire to bridge perspectives rather than draw lines. The audience responded with a brief round of applause, acknowledging the balance being struck. The camera panned across the table, showing the hosts listening attentively, and then briefly cut to the audience, where viewers appeared engaged and focused. As the segment approached its later moments, one of the hosts asked Brad Pitt how conversations like this influence his future decisions. He answered by saying that hearing different viewpoints challenges him to think more deeply and reconsider assumptions. He emphasized that disagreement can be productive when it's grounded in respect. Whoopi followed by saying that she believes live television has a unique role in modeling that kind of respectful disagreement. She explained that viewers often take cues from what they see on screen, and that showing people listening to each other, even when they don't agree, can have a positive impact. The tone at the table felt settled now, not because the disagreement had disappeared, but because it had found its place within a broader conversation. The hosts smiled more often, and the pacing felt natural, neither rushed nor heavy. Brad Pitt thanked the panel again for the opportunity to talk openly. He said that these moments remind him why he values long-form conversations over quick sound bites. His voice carried a note of appreciation rather than relief, suggesting he saw the exchange as worthwhile. Whoopi responded by saying that she appreciated his willingness to stay engaged and not shy away from difficult topics. She noted that not all guests are comfortable doing that on live television, and that his presence added depth to the conversation. The audience applauded again, this time a bit more warmly, signaling that the room felt at ease. The show began transitioning toward its final segments, but the earlier exchange remained part of the episode's identity. As the hosts moved on to the next topic, there was a brief moment where the camera lingered on Brad Pitt and Whoopi sharing a polite smile. It was a small gesture, but one that reinforced the sense that the disagreement had been handled professionally and respectfully. For viewers watching at home, the segment stood out not because of any dramatic confrontation, but because of how naturally it unfolded. It reflected the reality of live television, where conversations can shift direction and reveal deeper differences without becoming disruptive. By the time the show moved fully away from the discussion, the tone had settled into something reflective and grounded. The disagreement had not been erased, but it had been contextualized as part of a larger, ongoing dialogue. As the episode continued, social media chatter began to pick up, with viewers commenting in real time about the exchange. Some noted how calm and thoughtful it felt, while others appreciated seeing two public figures articulate different perspectives without talking past each other. Within the studio, the energy remained steady. The hosts maintained their usual rhythm, and Brad Pitt remained engaged, participating in lighter moments as they arose. The earlier tension had given way to a sense of authenticity, reminding everyone watching that live television can still create space for meaningful conversation when it allows moments to breathe. As the episode moved toward its closing minutes, the show's pace naturally began to shift. The hosts glanced occasionally toward the clock, signaling that the broadcast was approaching its final stretch, but there was no sense of urgency to abruptly wrap things up. Brad Pitt remained at the table, relaxed but attentive, and Whoopi maintained her steady, composed presence. The earlier discussion wasn't revisited directly, but its impact lingered in the way the hosts framed their final questions and remarks. One of the co-hosts took a moment to acknowledge the range of topics that had been covered during the segment. She mentioned that conversations like the one viewers had just seen are part of what makes live television unpredictable and engaging. Her tone was conversational, not reflective or dramatic, simply noting what had happened in a matter-of-fact way. Brad Pitt smiled and agreed, saying that he appreciates environments where conversations can evolve naturally. He remarked that it's rare to have enough time on television to explore ideas without being rushed to a conclusion. His voice was calm, and his posture suggested ease rather than fatigue. For viewers, it felt like someone wrapping up a thoughtful conversation rather than concluding a tense exchange. Whoopi added that live television doesn't always provide neat endings, and that's okay. She explained that real conversations often end with people still thinking, still processing, and still disagreeing in some ways. Her comment was delivered with the same steady authority she'd carried throughout the segment, reinforcing the idea that the lack of a clear resolution wasn't a failure, but a reflection of reality. The studio audience responded with light applause, the kind that acknowledges a point without turning it into a moment. The energy in the room felt settled and respectful. There were no visible signs of discomfort or lingering tension, just the sense that something substantive had taken place. As the hosts began their closing remarks, one thanked Brad Pitt for taking the time to join the panel and for engaging openly in the discussion. He responded graciously, thanking the hosts in return and expressing appreciation for the opportunity to talk in depth rather than just promote a project. His tone was sincere, and his words suggested that he viewed the experience as meaningful. Whoopi offered a final comment, saying that she values guests who are willing to stay present even when conversations become challenging. She emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean division, especially when people listen to each other. Brad Pitt nodded in agreement, and the two exchanged a brief, polite smile that didn't feel performative, just human. As the segment officially ended, the audience applauded more fully. The applause wasn't explosive or celebratory, but warm and sustained, signaling appreciation for the discussion. The show transitioned smoothly into its closing moments, with the hosts thanking viewers for tuning in and previewing upcoming episodes. Once the episode aired, viewer reactions began to surface almost immediately. On social media, clips of the exchange circulated, often accompanied by commentary that focused on tone rather than conflict. Many viewers remarked on how refreshing it was to see a disagreement handled calmly on a daytime talk show. Others shared which perspective resonated more with them, but the overall conversation remained measured. Some viewers praised Whoopi for pressing the issue and articulating the role she believes public figures play in shaping conversations. Others appreciated Brad Pitt's emphasis on reflection and nuance, noting that his responses felt thoughtful rather than evasive. Importantly, much of the discussion centered on the ideas exchanged, not on personal attacks or sensational framing. In the days following the broadcast, the show briefly referenced the segment again, acknowledging the volume of feedback it received. The hosts clarified that the conversation reflected differing viewpoints and was never intended to create division. They reiterated that respectful disagreement is a cornerstone of the show's format. Brad Pitt's team did not issue any formal statements, and none seemed necessary. The appearance was widely understood as a thoughtful exchange rather than a controversy. Entertainment commentators noted that the moment stood out precisely because it didn't rely on raised voices or dramatic gestures. For regular viewers of daytime talk shows, the segment served as a reminder of what live television can offer when it allows conversations to unfold organically. It showed how discussions can shift unexpectedly, how tone and body language matter, and how disagreement doesn't have to derail a broadcast. Inside the studio, those who attended the taping later shared that the atmosphere remained professional throughout. There were no extended breaks or visible interventions from producers. The conversation had been allowed to breathe, and that restraint was evident on screen. Looking back, the moment didn't redefine the show or dominate headlines, but it left an impression. It became one of those segments viewers remember not for what was said verbatim, but for how it was handled. Calm, honest, and grounded, it reflected the everyday reality of conversations happening across living rooms and workplaces. As television continues to evolve, moments like this highlight the enduring value of live, unscripted dialogue. They show that even familiar formats can still surprise, not through spectacle, but through authenticity. If you watched the episode or have thoughts about how the conversation unfolded, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.